ensayas rápido, entonces a ver quién pone el pie. Lo ensayas rápido, entonces a ver quién pone el pie.
Welcome back to Civil Discourse Now. I'm Mark Small.
And I'm Paul Lockton.
We're coming to you from Indianapolis, Indiana on July 7th, 2012. Our guests are Jeff Cox, who's an Indianapolis attorney, just being a frequent guest on our show. And also Adam Lenkowski, who's an attorney here in Indianapolis also. Welcome, Adam.
Thank you.
You were a guest on another show, but...
I was a guest. This is actually my second time on this show, but the first time, unfortunately, the audio recorder was not turned on.
And that was my fault because I didn't take tech and...
I thought that was our mime show.
Actually, it was. We were discussing the legality of miming. And whether a mime... When an officer arrests a mime, does the officer have to advise the mime that he has the right to remain silent?
I saw that episode of Police Squad where they had the ransom note delivered by a mime. And so they had to play charades to determine where the ransom was to be delivered and when.
We are here on discussing the next three segments. The recent Supreme Court decision on National Federation of Independent Business and Others versus Sebelius, also known as the Affordable Care Act bill, it was the Supreme Court decision that was handed down on June 28th that affirmed a big part of the ACA.
The mandate.
Yes, and Paul, you've read all 193 pages of that decision?
That would be an exaggeration. I read parts, I skimmed parts, I fell asleep during parts of it, but I have looked at just about the entire thing. There were two main issues there was a preliminary issue.
Well, there were two preliminary issues, and one of which that I found rather interesting, and that had to do with whether this case was subject to the Anti-Injunction Act, and if the Supreme Court had jurisdiction.
Yeah, what the Anti-Injunction Act does is it prevents you from bringing a lawsuit regarding the collection of a tax before that tax has actually gone into effect. And what happened here was the Supreme Court, under the Anti-Injunction Act, they found that it was a penalty, not a tax. So therefore, they went on to the merits of the case. But then
we'll get there. We'll get there in a minute.
Okay, and I should point out part of the reason why is because in the bill itself, it calls it a penalty, doesn't call it a tax. And during the debates, they were saying, "Oh, this is a penalty, not a tax."
Right.
The people who advocated.
And then during oral argument at the Supreme Court, and I believe there were 3 days of oral argument that weren't broadcast. They would read summaries, and I think, but they weren't broadcast because they do not broadcast from the Supreme Court chambers. There was a lot of argument about whether this was a tax.
Right, and the government actually flipped sides and said, well, it can be justified under the Commerce Clause, it can be justified under the Necessary and Proper Clause related to the Commerce Clause, or it almost threw this in at the end, it can be justified as a tax.
Yeah. Well, in fairness, it is not unusual to argue alternative theories, even some alternative theories that are mutually exclusive, or to hold something legal or constitutional. That's what the government did here.
But in this case, arguing mutually exclusive theories would have meant that they might not have proceeded to the merits of the case, because under the Anti-Injunction Act, they were arguing that it was a penalty. Under the Constitution, they were arguing it was actually a tax.
Well, and if you go back to, this wasn't the only case. This was brought in United States District Court in Florida. There also were, I think, 4 other circuits that had cases rise on appeal, and this case went up to the Court of Appeals for the what, 10th? Or which,
It's actually 3 different cases they combined.
okay, or the Third Circuit, I think, whichever circuit it was on this, the district court found that the mandate was unconstitutional and you had to throw out the whole statute. The Court of Appeals found that the mandate was constitutional, but the expansion of Medicaid wasn't, and then but they could be severed. And so the mandate could go ahead. Then it came up to the United States Supreme Court, and they had to determine whether the anti-injunctive statute applied. Did I get that right?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, so you have this tableau, also of other circuits saying, I like the tableau. You got other circuits ruling that it was peachy keen. I think the DC Circuit said it was, the whole thing was.
I don't think that was the term they used, peachy keen.
It's a technical legal application, just like mustard and ketchup. But the thing was, there were other circuits that had ruled on this. Everything was combined and it came up on this case. So
Correct.
Okay.
And you get beyond the injunction issue, then you had the 2 major ones. I refer to as the individual mandate, which says that if you are not covered or you don't get your own health insurance, you have to pay I want to call it a tax or penalty. You have to pay, I think,
amount of money.
Amount of money. I think it starts out $695. I read that.
It's a percentage. It's based on your
Percent.
income.
Or no less than. It's like
No,
2.5% of your income, but no less than $695.
Okay, that's how it is. And the second part, which didn't get a lot of initial coverage but has since, is the Medicaid expansion. Part of the bill required the states to expand their Medicare programs. Medicaid program, exactly. Medicaid, not Medicare. Medicare is health insurance for the poor. While
Medicaid is health insurance for the poor.
You're right.
Paul, I know you're nervous right now.
Yeah,
You're on
I've never
TV.
been on camera before.
Right.
So anyway, but and at the threat of losing all their Medicaid funding, states were told they had to expand their Medicaid program.
Yeah, and Medicaid originally was set up to aid the poor, the disabled,
Correct.
the blind. What the Affordable Care Act sought to do was expand it to cover also any persons making less than 133% of the poverty level
Right.
per year. So that would have meant working poor would have had coverage. But the penalty, not a tax, against a state that refused to participate in the expansion was they would not receive their Medicaid funding.
They would lose all Medicaid.
All Medicaid, and the federal government was going to pony up like 90% or close to 100% initially of the expansion and then fund 90% of it. In other words, giving the states a whole bunch of money to fund the expansion of the Medicaid. And I think Governor Daniels was one governor who said he would turn it down on philosophical grounds. That was before he left for his $1 million a year job at Purdue.
Well, I don't think we've confirmed it's $1 million a year, but we might want to talk about the first segment first.
Yeah.
The individual mandate first, because that's how they.
Yeah, Jeff brought up a very interesting point when we were off camera about the reading of the opinion. Because when I'm reading the opinion, I get the feeling that Justice Roberts was trying to explain things on a very elementary level.
I think, Jeffy, wanted you to respond to that, but I think that is part of being a Chief Justice and you presenting the opinion of the court. You want to explain it so people can understand. I don't know if they.
I don't think he was trying to explain it at a very elementary level. I think it was using elementary level logic that really doesn't apply to people over the age of maybe 6, because this is a very poorly written opinion. And you
Hold back how you feel, Jeff.
it is. It's a very poorly written opinion. It jumps around, and it seems to be almost. And the Supreme Court has been guilty of this ever since Marbury versus Madison, of bootstrapping
They did in Marbury.
Yeah, well, and to a certain extent, it was essential in Marbury versus Madison, because why would the Constitution have created a Supreme Court if not to review stuff?
Right.
But
they got around, that wasn't directly the issue in that case.
Right, but they review stuff that they've said in the past, which is stare decisis. They say, well, because we've said this in the past, we say it, again, but they don't often take that logic to its logical extension. And like in the big case in the Commerce Clause that they talk about is the Wickard case.
The wheat case.
Right.
Where you can't grow wheat on your own property for your own self because it might conceivably, possibly at some point affect interstate commerce.
Well, yeah, but you have to understand also, when I was a kid, we'd hear about, I couldn't understand how people, my father would say, if we owned farmland, and we'd be driving down the road and somebody wouldn't have anything planted in a field. And I'd say, why is that? My father would say, that land's in government. And that was the phrase in our area for meaning that the government was paying that farmer not to grow something there. Because that's maintaining prices of commodities by paying people not to grow them so that there's not a flood of stuff on the market. So in this case, they were dealing with a Kansas farmer, Wickard,
Yeah.
who was receiving money for not growing wheat and then wanted to grow more wheat himself. I think that was the whole point, because price control was on wheat. And so the reason that's germane to this case is...
No pun intended.
Well, we weren't talking about the Germans. Chief Justice Roberts said why the Commerce Clause does not apply in this case.
Before we get into that, Mark, I think we need to maybe back up, because most of our viewers are not necessarily trained attorneys, and explain to them the way federalism is structured. With any time that the federal government, I prefer saying national government because federal technically could mean both, but anytime the national government does something, it is supposed to be related to something specifically in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the enumerated powers, which is a laundry list of things. One of those on the laundry list is the power to regulate interstate commerce.
And commerce amongst the Indian tribes.
Right. And then at the very end of that, there's the necessary and proper clause to do anything necessary and proper related to one of the other.
Necessary and proper means that you're using whatever you need to do to get done these enumerated powers.
Right.
Is okay.
Well, yeah,
It's got to be related to another power.
Yeah.
And then the final one is that's been used is the power to tax for the general welfare.
Well, that was an amendment. That's the 16th amendment, I believe.
No, it's not the 16th.
No, there's
That's
power to
13.
tax.
Oh, that's 13.
No, that's income tax.
You're talking about the income tax, the
Yeah.
16th, but that wasn't because of the 16th amendment.
Right.
But that just gave them the revenue. So anyway, I want to give people that background. So the three that they looked at, in the opinion, was the Commerce Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause, which I agree has to be sort of related to another power, and then the taxing clause. And that, I think we should go through each of those and say, the Justice Roberts dismissed the Commerce Clause.
Yeah,
As
and we're at the end of this segment, and so we're going to dismiss that comment for just the time being until we come back here in just a minute.